Tēnā koutou katoa, haere mai ke tēnei hui, ke te mana whenua rangitānei, he mihi nui, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Good morning and welcome to the Planning and Strategy Committee for the 30th of June. Just a bit of housekeeping to start off with. Our meeting is being recorded and also is live streamed on our Council's YouTube channel. In case there is an emergency, we will follow our committee administrators out towards the clock tower on Te Maraohine, who will support us to evacuate. There's toilets out in the link span, and there is a defibrillator on the ground floor if we need it. If your name is not said before you start speaking, if you could just introduce yourself for the recording, that would be great. And we'll move on to apologies. So we've got an apology from Councillor Bowen for early departure on council business. Are there any other apologies? Great, I will move those, seconded by Councillor Hancock, and I'll invite you to vote. Great, that has carried 100%. I haven't had notification of any additional items, so we'll move on to declarations of interest, if any. Great, moving on. Item 4 is public comment. We do have a number of people here to provide public comment regarding item 7 today. Just before we do that, I'm just going to ask the Chief Planning Officer, got that right, to quickly just outline the process of item 7 so that we're clear on that, and then we will go to public comment for those who are wishing to make it.
Kia ora koutou. Thank you, Madam Chair. Yes, as the Chair has said, there's a number of people wanting to make public comment today. I think that's useful that they're showing interest in a planning process in and around their residents. Just to clarify before there is those people make that public comment, so this planning process is what we call a private plan change request. So the rezoning proposal has been put forward by a private applicant, a little bit like a resource consent application. So it's not a rezoning proposal that's been prepared or promoted by the council. If it was, there would have been engagement and consultation by the council with those residents. So the process from here is there's an opportunity for public comment today, but the options for the council are quite limited at this stage. So it's been lodged with the council, and the council can either accept, adopt, or reject the proposal. There's not really grounds to reject the proposal because the information is there to start the process. But to make it clear, if the council accepts the proposal, which is the recommendation, there would then be a full public consultation process, which opens the door, provides the opportunity for submissions, 2 rounds of submissions, and then a public hearing where submitters can speak to their submissions, and commissioners would make a decision, and then there'd be an opportunity for appeal. So while there's opportunity to make public comment today, there will be a full and thorough public submissions process which follows with a public hearing. So we just thought we'd clarify that at the start of the morning.
Thank you, David. I think that's useful. Right, so moving on to public comment. First on my list, I've got Ted Anderson.
Thank you.
Good morning, Ted. So you've got 3 minutes to speak.
Yep, thank you. I am Ted Anderson. I'm a resident of Meadowbrook Drive, and my wife and I, we oppose the plan change request for the Whiskey Creek residential area. With climate change causing more frequent and severe weather events, we will see more flooding such as happened recently in Canterbury. The developers say they can keep their new houses safe from flooding. However, they certainly cannot control the amount of any floodwater. They can only divert that floodwater to another area, making it far worse for another group of residents. The problem will still exist. You cannot make it go away. Therefore, leave things as they are. Thank you.
Thank you, Ted. Okay. Our next public comment is from John Anderson.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks for the opportunity to speak. I've been a resident of Meadowbrook Drive for 46 years and seen the land over the back of us flood 4 times. Certainly this proposal is going to affect our lifestyle and quality of life. We'd like you to consider that as the proposal goes through. The amenity of light is going to be taken away from us because all our houses, as they were developed to face the sun from the northwestern side, which is the back boundary. We're only about 20 metres off the back fence. So if one was to put a 5-metre structure up the back of us, we'd lose the sun at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And a lot of us have mountain views as well. In fact, on my title, it says I have a 145-degree view. That's going to disappear. The other thing to think about is windage on our properties. If you put up dwellings, and some of them are going to be 11 metres high, you're going to channel that wind onto our properties, which is going to cause further damage. And you're going to say, no, this is going to not cause damage, but go along Rangatiki Street and walk between the State Insurance Building. When a good zephyr is blowing, you'll feel that wind pressure. I'm a sailor, I understand wind. The other one is Horizons have that land as a Zone 1 floodway, and it is subject to liquefaction. Now, the government informed local authorities and councils when considering where to put residential housing, think twice about going on floodplains. Because I think, as a ratepayer to Palmas and North, if you get it wrong, you might have a short-term gain with additional sanctions, which are all towns are looking for, but you're going to have a short-term, long-term loss of claims against the council for allowing people to build on floodplains. I will be putting in a submission against it when it's invited, and we'll follow up in the future. So I thank you for the opportunity to talk. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Our next public comment is from Tony Cade.
Yeah, good morning. Thank you for the opportunity to speak this morning. I live at 1 Meadowbrook Drive. I've circulated that for everybody and that as well, so I won't read it in its entirety, but I'll go over a couple of the key areas. Horizons floods, hazards, and the one plan information sheet for territorial authorities, that document there. The 6 floodways, including the one in Flodger's Line. The intent in policy 9.2a is to avoid risk to people and property from the floodway and to ensure that effective functioning of the floodway by avoiding the placement of buildings, solid fences, etc. in a place where they will impede the flow of water. Horizons' position is that there should be no more developments, i.e. no new or extended structures or activities in the Kopiti or Flodger's Line floodways. This means that no one should build or extend a house, dairy shed, power pylon, etc. or subdivide within these floodways. I understand the land holding behind Meadowbrook Drive is zoned Flood Channel 1, which is the highest rating for floods. When addressing building on floodplains, the Resource Management Act requires local authorities to avoid or mitigate the risk, but council should err on the side of caution, and environmental engineer Nigel Mark Brown stated, who specialises in flood assessments. You should be avoiding wherever possible. This means not building on a floodplain. Massey University physical lecturer Ian Fuller, who specialises in flood histories, stated, "We don't have sufficient data to tell us enough about the frequency of big floods, and rather than try to mitigate flood risk for new housing developments, council should be avoiding it altogether." It's well documented there have been at least 4 significant floods in the last 40-odd years. During the June 2015 flood in Palmas North, Horizons Regional Council activated its plan to divert floodwaters into Whiskey Creek and to relieve pressure on the Mungoni stream and to prevent flooding in the northern parts of the city. Repairing flood damage to the stretch of flygers line between Rangatiki Street on the outskirts of Palmas North could cost more than $4.4 million, it was stated at the time. And indeed, the damage to Flygers Line bordering on this proposed initiative remains damaged and restricted to 1 lane in places after the flooding on 20th of June. Further to that, all the residents in Meadowbrook Drive, we have stop banks behind our rear fences. Appendix from Harriet Fraser, beginning on page 420 of the document, is modelled on 150 sections and 157 cars with the predicted traffic movements based on this. This rationale is flawed. As at 30th of June, there were 3,467,216 passenger cars and vans on the road in New Zealand. That was 20. In June 2021, there were 4,860,550 people in New Zealand, a rough ratio of 1 car to every 1.4 man, woman and child. Her calculations are hugely conservative and underrepresented. The true traffic count could be 2 to 3 times higher than her imperfect data and reasoning.
Tony, sorry to stop you there, but your 3 minutes is up. Can I just ask you to finish up the paragraph that you're on?
Yeah, I've got about 3 more paragraphs, if that's okay.
Well, I won't allow that because we have got it in front of us, so I will just ask you to finish up your comments now.
Okay. So basically, yeah, we are hugely impacted, in particular on our household, because we get a road beside us, we get a roundabout out the front of us, access to our house will be prohibitive. We're going to have to back out into areas of roundabouts and stuff like that, and I'm really concerned about the huge miscalculations in that traffic management.
Okay. Thank you, Tony, for your comments.
Thanks.
And our so our next public comment is Ren Hamilton. No, Ren's not here. Okay. Was there anyone else wishing to make public comment? Hi. You're welcome to come on down. Please introduce yourself. Is this around the same item?
I've done this before. Just need a minute, sorry. My name is Ruth Hodgins and I live at 11 Meadowbrook Drive. I'd like to register my opposal to the proposal that's coming forward and look forward to you making a decision where we can publicly consult and put forward our full consideration around that. I agree with everything that the people have said today, but one of the things that's really important is why I chose to live in Meadowbrook Drive. I mean, we made the decision to make that our permanent home. We made the decision understanding that there was a flood zone behind us and that it wouldn't be built out. We've spent the last 7 years of our lives building and developing our house to enjoy the view, the privacy, the space, our living area and deck face onto that. We live and breathe that lifestyle every day. From 5 o'clock in the morning, I am out the back. We have built and planted trees to attract the birds, to bring in the lifestyle from the paddock and coming into that space. We have a beautiful view of Ruapehu on a lovely day. All of that, including the important things around the sun, the wind, the changes, and actually it's a flood zone are all really important reasons why there needs to just be some step back and some serious consideration around choosing this area to develop. I understand that we need housing. I just don't agree that that's the right place to develop the housing in Palmerston North. I think there's better options out there. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruth. Is there anyone else wishing to make public comment? Okay, great. Well, I'll move that the public comment from Ted Anderson, John Anderson, Tony Cade and Ruth Hodges be received for information, seconded by Councillor Hancock. Thank you. I'll invite you to vote.
She said tonight.
Yes, there was a written comment from.
Great, that vote has carried 100%. You may have just heard a comment from the gallery. We had a couple of emails come through in terms of communication, just directed to me as chair, putting in their support for the comments that we've largely of what we've heard today. And I'm happy to circulate those with everyone, but those were not considered public comment because it's an email communication to an elected member. But we do have records of those and they've come through officers. So now we're moving on. I have switched the order slightly, so I'm just moving items 6 and 7 around. I'm moving item 7 up now to... No, we've got the minutes on the screen. We'll just jump to those quickly. I will move that the minutes of the Planning and Strategy Committee meeting of the 12th of May 2021, Part 1 Public, be confirmed as a true and correct record, seconded by Councillor Hancock. Is there any comment on the minutes? Great, I'll invite you to vote on those. And that has carried 100%. So we're now going to move to item 7, which is the Whiskey Creek private plan change request. We've got Michael coming to speak to that.
Looks like we might be having some clicker issues, but I think, good morning everyone. I think in the meantime, the Chief Planning Officer has probably covered off a lot of what I've got in the short presentation anyway, in terms of process and I guess the options. It's probably helpful just to go back to the recommendations in the committee memo. Yeah, really the options that we have available to us are to adopt, accept or reject, and as the Chief Planning Officer mentioned, rejection isn't really an option that stacks up from a regulatory perspective, and the recommendation is to accept the private plan change application and to go up for public notification. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Michael. I've got a question to start with. Obviously, you've heard that there is some concern and opposition from neighbours at this early stage, particularly around the flood classification. Is it your view that we should proceed to a full public consultation to give them that opportunity to be heard and have their views considered through that process? Or would you see that their views should be considered at this stage?
I think it would be more appropriate to have those concerns addressed through the formal consultation process. In terms of some of those flooding issues that were identified, looking at the information that's been received by the private plan change application, they have addressed some of those concerns in there, and I think the public process provides an opportunity to explore what the applicant's proposing and then to express views in terms of whether they support or oppose it, and that can be dealt with through a evidence-based decision-making process and through a future hearing. There's nothing in the private plan change application to me that suggests that it should be rejected outright. So on that basis, my recommendation would be to go to the full public consultation process and have that process, I guess, filter those concerns out.
Okay, thank you. We do have a number of questions. Councillor Finlay.
Thank you. Yeah, on page 116, you get the 4 choices given to us, and one of those is to reject the request in whole or part. But you're saying to us we can't reject it at this stage?
My recommendation is that there aren't any grounds to reject it in whole or in part based on the information that's provided. My reading of the report is that it meets the requirements of Section 32 of the Resource Management Act, and on that basis, we should be publicly consulting on it.
Okay, a further question then. A few years ago, there was a proposal to put a industrial area in the same bit of land, and that failed at resource management. Would that not show that this bit of land is unsuitable for development and it shouldn't be allowed to go any further? Can that not be taken into account?
I think this is a different application, and I think regarding the information that they put forward, I think the process for public consultation, the public hearing requirements, and the process that's set out in the Resource Management Act is sufficient to be able to address any of those concerns that come through. I'd just like to note that the applicant, and I don't want to be speaking on their behalf, but they are seeking to develop in areas that are outside of the flood zone, and where they are looking to go closer to that edge, they've made some suggestions around how they can manage that. So they will have to work through with Horizons, and there is, from my perspective, there's sufficient information here to accept it for public notification. So I guess the mega mall situation that you're referring to is quite a different prospect. The details of it are quite different to this, and I wouldn't think that based on the decision for that private plan change application, this one should also be turned down either in whole or in part.
Thank you.
Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Thanks, Michael, for the report. My questions are around the advice to accept this as a private plan change rather than adopt it as a council plan change. And in your report to us, you've given the reason for not adopting it as a council plan change as being about resourcing. Are there any advantages if we provided resourcing? Are there any advantages in adopting it as a council plan change as opposed to leaving it to a private plan change? So you've given us the negative, in other words, but what's the positive of that?
The process itself would be exactly the same. It really comes down to resourcing, and there's another item coming up shortly talking about some of the work that the city planning team is leading out over the next sort of 6 to 12 months, and I think it's fair to say, if I'm being candid here, that the team is going to be stretched delivering the existing work program, and probably wouldn't be helpful, I guess, to have another plan change on the books for the team to manage. So the private plan change process does allow for that to be, I guess, dealt with by the applicant, and so our recommendation is to go with the accept rather than the adopt. There wouldn't be any major benefits for us bringing it in-house.
Okay, and what about for the residents who've come in today to, voice their disquiet about this plan change? Is there any disadvantage to them in it being a private plan change as opposed to it being adopted by council as a council plan change?
No, it's the same process. What we can do, and I have had some conversations with some of the residents in the gallery in the lead up to this meeting, as have other members of the team, and what we would like to do in the lead up to the notification process going forward, if it's approved, would be to meet with residents and give them an opportunity to understand the process. It's something that we would do regularly with the council initiated plan change as well. We won't be advocating any positions, we'll just be talking about what the process is and how to engage in it, and help them understand how to navigate that process, because I can understand that for a lot of people the process could be a bit daunting, so hopefully we can shed a bit of light on that process and help them to engage in that as fully as they can.
Okay, so the fact that council isn't the one leading the plan change won't mean, I'm going to do a double negative, but despite that, council can still be involved and assist residents with the consultation and the process.
Yes, we'll be responsible for notifying the plan change. It'll just be that the costs for that process will be recovered from the applicant.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and somewhat along similar lines around whether it's a private plan change or council-led. And I guess you've clarified around process, but thinking about it in terms of outcomes, are there any scenarios where the outcomes could be different and or improved if it was council-led rather than the private change?
The plan change, if it's approved and goes up for consultation, the process means that there'll be submissions that'll be heard and the applicant will be required to respond to that, as would council if we were running it ourselves. Ultimately, it'll be up to commissioners, and I imagine there'll be a mix of councillors on that panel as well who will make a decision on that plan change. Council officers will likely be submitting on the plan change as well, so we won't be absent from the process. And then ultimately the commissioners will make a decision, and then if there are appeals, then that process allows another opportunity for submitters to be involved.
So your view then is the outcomes would be substantively identical, regardless of which track we went?
Correct.
Thank you. Madam Chair.
Councillor Beattie.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Michael, for your report. Michael, is there any council budgets? I see there's quite a bit of infrastructure like the roundabouts and roading and things that will have to take place. So how do we marry up, if this does go through, how do we marry up the council budgets, and is there any existing budgets in the...
I'll be covering that off a little bit later as well. This plan change has been on the cards for some years now. I think the council was approached about this before the last LTP was developed. In our 2019 housing needs assessment, we identified this as a growth area, so it's in our strategic direction as well, that this area would possibly be developed over time through private plan change. The current LTP has been developed with this in mind as well, because we are required as part of our requirements under the National Policy Statement for Urban Development to think about what our housing needs are. This was flagged as one of those options, and so we had to make sure that infrastructure was going to be budgeted to help support this. Some of the network infrastructure is the responsibility of council to provide. That will have a citywide impact, so that's baked into things like our development contributions policy. Anything above and beyond that will be developed and provided by the developer themselves, and things like that roundabout may require a developer agreement, and that can be actioned through the development contributions policy. So there shouldn't be any issues from a land use and an infrastructure planning perspective from council.
Okay, Okay, thank you. May I ask another question? And just a second question, I'm looking at the Water Supply Services Assessment Report. There's nothing in there about storage on any of the sections. Is that something that the council should be looking at? Like there's no water storage tanks or any requirement?
As far as I'm aware, we don't have any requirements in our district plan that trigger a need for on-site water services. It's likely that there'll be some sort of stormwater tanks or some sort of stormwater management requirements, given that there's a floodplain there, and the approach across the city now tends to require, particularly for infill development, stormwater tanks which can provide some sort of storage, but that's generally to manage stormwater issues. It can deal with some resilience issues for natural disasters. And
so can we not trigger this through this private plan change? Do we have to go through the district plan to change that requirement?
There would have to be an infrastructure need to justify it, and if that was something that the council wanted to submit on as part of this, then that could be done. I guess the evidence would have to stack up to justify it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Councillor Hancock.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Just a very brief question, Michael. Just you touched on it, that this is an area that's identified for residential growth, but bearing in mind sort of the comments which have been made, and I think sort of the general sort of information that's provided within the application itself, is it likely that because of the flood risk that this would actually then become sort of the outer limits of the northwestern part of residential growth for the city?
Yes, I think just due to the geography of the site and the floodway existing there, I think that would be the case, and the applicants actually sought to deliberately design the subdivision in a way that it creates an ultimate urban edge and try and create some sort of transition between that rural-urban environment. At the moment, if you're driving from Whanganui into the city, I guess your visual experience coming to the city is that you see a wall of fencing as you approach the city, and what the applicant, my reading of the application, is seeking to do is to try and create more of a transition to urban edge with that park-like setting along the flood corridor and then transitioning into housing.
Great, thank you, and thanks, Madam Chair.
Councillor McCarlett.
Apologies, Madam Chair. I thought I'd remove myself from the...
No worries. Councillor Dennison.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just wanted to, thank you, Michael. Just wanted to confirm the timeline that could be expected is for the residents, that you'll engage with them to outline them the process, and also the opportunity for them to submit when that's likely to be, and then the time it will take to get to the commissioners, just as a basic timeline, please.
If the private plan change request is approved for public consultation, then we'd probably look to do that mid-July, and then there'd be 20 working days of original submissions, and then there'll be a summary of submissions for that, and we'll re-notify for further submissions. I'd imagine we'd get to a hearing perhaps as early as the end of the year, but depending on the level of submissions that are received and any sort of technical requirements, it may be an early next year requirement, but it'll largely be dependent on what's received through the public consultation phase, but I'd imagine the formal submission process would be wrapped up by the end of September.
You mentioned as a supplementary that you would engage with the residents to outline the process. How soon, or how do you see approaching that?
I think what we would do is we'd try to get contact details from those that have contacted council already, and then look to arrange some sort of public forum of some sort, or whether it's a meeting here at council. We'll have to determine what might be the best approach, but as early as next week or the week after, depending on I guess availability of staff, but we'd look to try and do that before the submission process opens, so that the submitters have a good lead in time to be able to participate in that process.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Chair.
Just as a follow-up to the question from Councillor Dennison, Michael, can I ask, with the, I guess, the opportunity to meet with residents and explain the submission process, would that also include kind of walking through how to pull a submission together for that process? Because I know that the RMA process can be quite different to sort of normal, submissions and hearings and those sorts of things. So would it be that sort of level of information being presented?
Yes, the RMA submission process is quite rigid, and so if we have had issues in the past where submissions haven't really met the form requirements, which makes it difficult in terms of responding to them and the legality around them. We try to make it as, I guess, user-friendly as we can, but in my experience, there's a lot of value in meeting with individuals and groups to sort of talk through the process to help them be able to write a good submission so that they can get their points across clearly. So yes, the intention would be to explain how the process works and how to populate a submission in a way that's going to achieve the ends that they seek.
Great, thank you. Councillor Finlay.
Thank you. 2 points. You mentioned the edge of the development, domestic development out in the floodplain. Now, at any stage, has Meadowbank Drive been planned as being that edge? So like when Meadowbank Drive was put in, there would have been a RMA review then. Was any decision made there that that would be the outer edge? Do you know?
I don't know.
Okay, could that be looked at? And also, if it goes to an RMA sitting, all the residents of Meadowbank Drive will be informed prior so they can put submissions in?
So part of the notification process would involve identifying who are directly affected parties, and then there will also be a broader public notification. So anyone, whether you live in New Zealand or internationally, can technically submit on a plan change, but we would look to identify affected parties, and I would imagine that as part of that notification assessment, residents on Meadowbrook Drive would be identified as directly affected parties.
So with the reaction today, it was pretty obvious that the people in Meadowbank Drive interested, so they would be informed?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. And it could be a meeting with them to show them how do they get prepare their submissions?
Yes.
Yeah.
Councillors, are there any other questions? Thank you, Michael. No further questions. So we've got 2 resolutions on the screen as per the order papers. So I'll move that the Whiskey Creek private plan change request by Flyers Line Investment Group Limited, included as attachment 1 to the memorandum titled Whiskey Creek private plan change request, presented to the Planning and Strategy Committee on 30 June 2021, be accepted pursuant to section 25(2)(b) part 2 of the first schedule of the Resource Management Act 1991, and that the Whiskey Creek private plan change request by Flyers Investment Group Limited be publicly notified in accordance with section 26 part 2 of the first schedule of the Resource Management Act 1991. Seconded by Councillor Hancock. Happy to take those as 2 separate resolutions when it comes to voting. So I'm happy to move these today because I think as we've heard from residents, and particularly I guess I've had a number of phone calls this week from other residents who haven't been able to make it, it's very clear that they want to have a say, and there has been particular concern probably around the misunderstanding of what this process here today is compared to what the process is that we are making a decision about. And one of the particular concerns is around the timing of notifying our public agenda papers for this resolution here compared to what the public notification period is. So as Michael outlined, it's 20 working days or 4 weeks for submissions, and one resident in particular that I spoke to was concerned that they only had a few days to go through and read the report, which they weren't able to read it in full, but they read a good amount of the report, and they were concerned that we were making a decision based on the information presented today around these sections being made available and this development happening. I think what's really clear is that the resolution to accept the plan change means that we will go to a full, fair and transparent process where we directly invite affected parties and then obviously publicly notify so anybody can have a say on what their views are on this proposal. And my view is that we have heard a good selection of residents this morning and this week who have shared their views, but that's not everybody who's directly affected. There are people who haven't had the opportunity to have their say, and that's because the process that we're in right now isn't exactly the process to have those views considered with making a decision around the plan change as a whole. So my view is that we do go to the next stage because the next stage is the formal process to hear those views. So those would be captured. We know that there is demand for sections across the city. We know that very clearly. We know that there's also mitigation required because we've heard quite clearly the concerns, particularly around the flood zone. But there's through the report it talks about other mitigation required with the plan change as a whole. But we also know there's quite a bit of concern around this proposal. So moving to the next step, accepting the plan change to go to public notification would then give a space for anybody who wants to have their say, and particularly those directly affected, to do so. So that's why I'm supporting and suggesting that we move to that as a next step. We'll just open up for wider comment. Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Yes, I'll be voting in support of the recommendations, but I just want to make it clear that voting in support of the recommendations is not to prejudge the outcome of the private plan change request. We really don't have good cause to reject this application under law, and so whether or not individual councillors believe or don't believe that this is a suitable place for building isn't really what's at issue today. What's at issue today is whether or not there are any grounds for rejecting the private plan change request, and advice from officers is that there are not. So were we to vote to reject it, we would simply be subjecting ourselves to an appeal through the Environment Court, which seems somewhat unnecessary. So I certainly support it on those grounds. And additionally, as the Chair has commented, because it takes us into a public consultation process where the residents who've come in today, plus any other people who wish to make a submission, can be heard in full and their views taken into account when a decision around the plan change is made. So today's decision isn't the green light to go ahead. Today's decision is to accept the plan change request to go up for public consultation. So we just need to be clear what today is about and what it's not about. Thanks.
Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and just to acknowledge and largely agree with the comments both from yourself and Councillor Johnson. I think the only further comment from me is just around the timing of this, and I guess probably that's where most of my concern actually sits, because we've got a raft of plan changes coming at us, and we've heard from officers that there's some constraint around resource and time availability around this, but as well that they will need to be actively engaging in terms of providing inputs into that planning process. And I would hate to think that we're creating such a full workload within council that we're running any risk of having less than ideal outcomes through these processes. So I've specifically asked that point around what sort of outcomes we might expect here, and I'm certainly hopeful that we are still in a position where we have the resource to really make sure that every one of the plan changes, including this, gets the full due diligence that it needs in terms of consideration on the way through the process.
Thank you. Councillor Finlay.
I can see the points the previous two councillors and yourself But I will be voting against number 1 for the simple reason I do not want to go to the commissioners at any stage and someone says it was unanimous by council. So I would like the commissioners to know that the council is not unanimous in supporting this plan change. So I will vote against it.
Thank you, Councillor. Are there any other comments? Great. We will vote on recommendation 1 first. That has carried 15 in favour with 1 against. And then second recommendation. That has carried 100%. Moving on to item 6, the Palmas North Housing Capacity Assessment Report, June 2021. We've got Michael and Peter. Thank you. You can start when you're ready.
Just got a short presentation here to cover off 2 reports that are appended to this particular memo. So they're both pieces of work that stem from our requirements under the National Policy Statement for Urban Development. So we've got a Urban Development Capacity Indicators annual report that Peter's going to quickly cover off, and then I'll be talking about our Housing Capacity Assessment. And I just wanted to take the time just to acknowledge Tara Leonard, who's just in the room up over here. So Tara's a graduate planner who works in our infrastructure unit, and she's been seconded to the city planning team in the last 5 months to complete this report. So this is Tara's first piece of work coming to the council chamber. So I just wanted to take the time just to acknowledge that. So Peter, I'll just hand off to you to cover off the annual report.
So just want to very quickly provide an overview of some of the key graphs or data from the annual report. The purple bar is the townhouses, flats, units and other dwellings built in the city, and been really positive trend, particularly over the last 3 years, seeing a lot more of that sort of housing happening in the city. And the key benefit of that is they're using land more intensively. And most of that decline in affordability is because of the cost of land increasing rather than the cost of construction. Just an update on that mix between relocatables and other. So the other houses is what's actually being built in the city. The net increase in stock is smaller than that because of the sections where houses are being demolished or shifted away, but certainly quite strong growth in that other category. We have in recent months this year seen a pickup in relocatables as well. And quite a strong decline in the average size or average floor area of houses being built. And we used to be above the average for New Zealand, but have actually now dropped below. Developments like the Soho development and the relocatables are contributing to that. And of course the Papio housing developments as well. And the rental stock, it is quite volatile in terms of growth. The council's own housing developments have added to that and add to that volatility as houses are demolished and then rebuilt. But we are still seeing growth in rental stock in the city.
Thanks, Peter. That'll just provide a little bit of context for this housing capacity assessment. So as I mentioned, it's a requirement under the National Policy Statement for Urban Development. So in July last year, the government released some new national direction, which was an update on the old MPS UDC. So this new version came out in July last year. And some slight tweaks in terms of some requirements for us. We've been identified as a Tier 2 city. And that places some extra requirements on us that didn't apply before. One of them being the requirement to set some housing bottom lines, so they're targets. We've got some recommendations which I'll cover off around that shortly. But the general thrust of the document is that council must ensure there's sufficient development capacity in the short, medium and long terms. So that's the short terms in the first 3 years, medium is 4 to 10 years, and then the long term is 11 to 30 years. So this is a story you've been told many times before, particularly by Peter, but drivers of growth, there's a lot of capital investment coming into the region, particularly close to Palmas and north, and this is really driving the demand for housing. And in terms of the demand, the assessment that has been undertaken has identified that it's been quite a shift in terms of the housing typology. We've seen a lot more intensification, a lot more infill development. It's become our predominant share of development across the city. And one of the really interesting things that we've identified is that unlike in previous years where we've seen a lot of infill happening in Hukawhiru and close to the hospital, it's actually quite evenly spread across the city. And that's really going to that point that Peter was talking about before around affordability and unaffordability really being driven by land prices. And so land prices have increased quite significantly across the city, which is leading to, I guess, more opportunity for redevelopment as well. So, yeah, as you can see in that bottom right graph or table, the share of greenfields reduced quite significantly in recent times, and infill has jumped up significantly. A lot driven by what's happening by Kāinga Ora, but also some of the work that Council's been doing at Papaoia as well. In terms of supply, the capacity assessments identified that there's capacity for another 2,737 urban homes, so that's a mix of infill and greenfield, and some lifestyle blocks as well. There's a lot of work underway at the moment to release more greenfield development, so in excess of 7,000. So that's going to be spread across the city, and that'll shape, or this is really going to influence some of the targets that I'll be talking about shortly. So here's a bit of a map of some of the city housing growth areas that we're working towards, and this is embedded in our LTP with our strategic housing growth planning. Big block out at Kakatangiata, an extension out at Alkotere, Whiskey Creek's identified in there, there's work underway at Ashurst, and some existing areas have already been zoned for housing at Whakarongo, and some work had been undertaken out at towards the Hukawhiru Lagoon, and some work underway for Roxburgh Crescent. So there's growth happening in basically all directions, or planned to be undertaken in all directions. In terms of our housing growth targets, so we're required to produce these now under the MPS. We have to embed this in our district plan as well. So it's a deliberate choice that council has to make in terms of what we're planning to do over the short, medium and long term. The recommendations that we've put into the report here reflect what's happening in the housing market over the last few years in particular. So what we're required to do is make sure that what we're looking to provide to the market is stacking up with what the market wants. So that's the underlying principle of the MPS. So one of the problems we've got at the moment in the short term is that greenfield supply is relatively limited, but if development trends continue as they have been over the last 2 years in particular, we have sufficient capacity to meet our requirements. So a lot of that will have to be accounted for through infill. There isn't really any other alternative. But looking at the development trends recently, it's likely that that's going to be the market preference anyway. In the medium term, we're looking to rezone some significant land. So previously I showed there's going to be about almost 8,000 greenfield lots that'll be rezoned, and that'll be something that'll come through over the next 18 months. That's likely to affect market preference just because there's going to be a greater availability of that. So we imagine there'll be a bit of a swing back towards greenfield in the market, and over time that may increase. That may change. We may see still more preference for infill development. What we have to do is update this every 3 years so we can take a bit of a watching brief and adjust as the market adjusts as well. But I guess the expectation is if you're going to rezone a lot of land, then there's probably going to be a lot of opportunity. I would like to temper that a little bit though, and I'm just going to show a few maps. This is the latest master plan draft for Kākatangiata. One of the issues out at Kākatangiata, although it's a significant piece of land, there's about in excess of 6,000 lots that we're looking to rezone out there. It's quite fragmented. The land ownership is quite fragmented. We've got in excess of 200 landowners out there. There's 1 or 2 large blocks out at the Manderson block and land that's owned by John Farquhar. That's likely to be taken up faster just because it's going to be easier to develop. What we are looking to do is, unlike the traditional greenfield urban development areas, we aren't just looking to provide for large sections on the outskirts of town. We're looking to try and develop some functional communities. There's a mix of section sizes that we're looking to achieve. We're looking at some medium density as well around some local shopping areas, public amenities, schools, those sorts of things. So it's a lot more of a comprehensive planning approach, but I would imagine that the likes of Kākatangiata would take in excess of 30 years to be fully developed just because of the land ownership patterns, but also land values are still so high in the city that it does make sense for people to still look at infill as an option. The same goes for our koutere. We're looking to provide for housing choice, so there's multi-unit areas that we've identified. There's a shopping centre village that we're looking at working through in as well. We're trying to create communities, not just housing on the outskirts of town. So quite a different approach for our greenfield planning. That'll provide some choice. It won't just be 500-600 metre squared lots. So in terms of other recommendations in the report, to meet our housing requirements, there's recommendations to do that greenfield rezoning out at our koutere, Ashurst and Kākatangiata. We need to look at promoting more multi-unit development and minor dwellings. So we made some changes to the district plan to make that easier to happen. We're seeing a little bit of uptake, but a lot of the multi-units really being delivered by large organisations like Kāinga Ora and Palmas City Council. We'd like to see more of that delivered by the market. Minor dwellings, we've only had about 10 built in the last sort of 18 months, despite the fact that it's been significantly deregulated and a lot more enabled, so a bit of a promotional campaign perhaps to try and get that moving. There could be some options for us to look at reducing the minimum lot size across the city, and that might enable more infill development to happen. What we identified was there was about 1,400 sections that could be developed under the existing district plan requirements, but I think that's quite a conservative and probably an underestimation of the development potential. That's keeping in mind that that would be in a situation where someone would keep an existing house. We're seeing a lot of people removing homes now and then looking to put sort of three houses in place. So although we've only shown that there's probably about 1,400, the theoretical opportunity is in excess of 10,000 if people remove homes. So we think there's actually a lot of scope for infill and intensification in the city. We might need to look at maybe lowering the minimum lot size further. There are a lot of applications looking to go less than 350 metres squared. So future district plan work will need to look at that. We've also got a recommendation to partner with the development community to encourage intensification. We're doing a little bit of this already. And I guess the summer haze conversation that's going on at the moment could provide another opportunity in that space. And there's recommendation around repurposing some underutilised council land, so the likes of Summer Haze, Hoia Reserve. There's a few recommendations in there around looking at some other potential council assets that are underutilised as well. And ultimately looking to enable more intensification across the city And even looking to require it in some places, this is something that some of the Tier 1 councils are having to do, particularly close to city centres, and having 6-storey buildings enabled. So one of the other requirements we have under the National Policy Statement is to look at developing a future development strategy. I think there's some big city planning moves that we've sort of flagged in this report. There's an opportunity through that future process to sort of flesh that out in a bit more detail and canvass public opinion around what might be, I guess, publicly acceptable around some of these changes, because there are some big changes being mooted in this report. But yeah, it probably requires a little bit more canvassing of opinion. So in terms of the committee recommendations, that the housing assessment be received. We've got some targets and some recommendations that we'd like to be adopted, and also for Peter's annual report for urban development capacity indicators also be received. Happy to take questions.
Thank you, Michael and Peter and Tara. We do have a number of questions, quite a few questions coming through. Okay, Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a couple questions for you, Michael. The first, the report mentions the Albert Street Depot and potential opportunities there, and I guess it just seems like we've heard quite a few times about that potential, but never really seen it get moving. So is it actually moving in the background in terms of that potential change, or does something need to happen to actually get things moving?
Yeah, I think the key next step there is to establish what the future requirements would be for a depot. We've got pending change regarding, the functions or services that council may or may not be responsible for. So that the first phase, I think, if we're to look for another location for the depot, is to understand what the needs are. So that's the most immediate step. As we've said, I think if we can relocate the depot, that site is effectively ready for development once the depot is relocated. So, as I said, the key aspect is working out what's required and where the depot could go.
Thank you. That's helpful to understand. I guess the real question is that already happening, or is there further impetus that's needed?
That work isn't underway at the moment, but it is intended that we will start some of that work this year. None of that has required any other input from council at this stage.
Thank you for clarifying that. Second question, Michael, is just around the implications of adopting the recommendations in the report. And I guess the one that stood out to me was particularly recommendation 9.6, which had a change of approach to the rating system, and just wondered about, given that we're also, as I understand it, finally on the cusp of reviewing the rating system, what the implications would be of council formally adopting a sort of fixed position around a view on that particular aspect of the rating system at this stage.
I think it is a recommendation that's has carried over from the previous housing needs assessment report that we did in 2019. I think if you wanted to keep the door open, that could be something you could consider. I'd probably just to provide a bit of background for those who might not be aware of the details of that recommendation. The current approach of the policy has, I guess, a bit of a perverse incentive for land banking, and it provides a discounted opportunity for land in excess of, I think it's 5 hectares. So if you've got zone land, say it's a big block, you only pay full rates for the first 5 hectares, and anything beyond that you pay a discounted rate. So when that was introduced was a low growth period, and that would have been that would have had quite a significant impact on landowners who just happened to own larger blocks that were available for development, and I guess that was why that was introduced. I'd probably argue at the moment that we don't have that situation, and that it does potentially incentivise some land banking, which has a flow-on effect for affordability. So That's why that recommendation is there, but yeah, ultimately that, we'll probably have to leave that up to you to make a decision around that, around 9.6.
Thanks. I guess just to follow up then, was any specific thought given to, I guess, whether or not there's risk of perception around predetermination of sort of where we'd be going with the rates review? Or was it simply that it was already in a previous report and it really just sort of flowed through?
It was in the previous report. I think as a suggestion, perhaps the wording could be changed to maybe consider that as part of the rating review.
Thank you. And finally, just around targets, so that infill target is currently sort of an amalgamation of a whole lot of things, but yet, when we look at the data, we can actually pull out things like apartments and multi-unit and that sort of stuff. Is there potential, I guess, to refine those targets a bit more so that we can actually see how much of that broad infill category is actually sort of the subdivision and how much of it's apartments, et cetera?
Yeah, it's something that we do include in our monitoring reports. So there's a quarterly report that Peter pulls together, and we do the annual report, and we do try to break it down into those individual categories for reporting purposes. I think, yeah, it's easy to sort of agglomerate it for reporting purposes, but if you're wanting some greater clarity around that mix, then that's something we could consider for future reporting.
I guess so sort of in hindsight, it's easy to monitor. I guess my question is whether we've got, in your view, enough evidence through these assessments to allow us to do some projections as well.
I think we do. I'd probably say there is quite a lot of effort that goes into analysing that consents data. I'd like to say that we can push a button and get the information out really easily, but it actually requires us having someone like Tara to trawl through screeds of spreadsheets to be able to get that information out. We do get it though, because we are interested in understanding that level of granularity. In terms of projecting forward, it is a little bit difficult because apartments and more intensive developments aren't a typology that we've seen a lot of over a long period of time. And so I guess having a low base to come from a data perspective, it might be difficult to be able to get a reliable projection for what we might be seeing in the future. We could, take a bit of a snapshot and project forward from that, but how reliable that might be, I'm not too sure. It may not be that valuable from a statistical perspective, but we can at least track the trends for now and see where that's going. And what we'd like to do is try to enable more of that to happen, and hopefully that happens, but that's really up to the market.
Great, thank you. Madam Chair.
Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Thanks, Michael and Peter, for the reports. My questions are also around the recommendations in 9.1 to 9, I think. And in particular, recommendation 9.3, which in full is around investigating opportunities to repurpose reserves for housing, and includes a line talking about repurposing sports fields for housing. And my understanding from your presentation and from your answers to Councillor Barrett is that if we vote for these recommendations, we're effectively giving the tick to the recommendations that you've got in the report. I do have some concerns about the repurposing of sports fields for housing. Can you just, I suppose, talk to us a bit more about what's intended there? And secondly, can you just confirm that my understanding is correct or it's not, that if we adopt your recommendations that we're giving the green light for sports fields to be repurposed as housing?
I'll answer that second part first. So the recommendation is to investigate that as an option rather than necessarily green lighting anything. So any proposals would have to be, well considered. I guess being a bit provocative here, I guess, in terms of what we're looking at and identifying here, and it's coming from a sustainable development perspective and looking to utilise land that may be better used for housing. It may not. So we're not seeking a green light to remove all the sports fields and then put houses on them. It's really about flagging that that's an opportunity and that there needs to be some further work done, and that's supposed to see whether or not that's appropriate or not, and imagine that there would be some considerable public feedback about that proposal.
Well, having recently been bitten by the small print in a report, I'm being quite careful to canvass exactly what it is that we're voting for today. So if we are uncomfortable with a recommendation, is your advice that we should just vote against the adoption of the recommendations? I don't see that a report like this we could really be amending because it's your report. Is that your advice? I mean, if an elected member was uncomfortable with one or more of your recommendations, what are the options right now? Is it just voting against adopting it?
One option could be that recommendations 9.1 to 9.6 are taken separately within the report itself. So, I mean, as we were going to, I mean, the chair's been working on an amendment regarding recommendation 9.6, so that it was more investigate, or that's referred to the ratings policy. But I mean, I think just on that section of the report, I mean, it relates to some commentary in the committee report and the executive summary as well, which, you know, there's a, I guess as officers pulling this together, we've been very conscious of council's broader objectives and targets. So, you know, this report is very much about housing, but we do have to, as Michael said, produce a future development strategy, and we've got, you know, a low carbon roadmap to drive down our emissions. One of the pieces of advice that will be coming through in the low carbon roadmap is one of the most strongest tools the council has to drive down emissions is its land use planning. So you'll see in, you know, section 3.6 of the committee report, what we actually say is alternative methods that could be explored via a future development strategy, low carbon roadmap and future district plan changes include, so the wording is could be explored, you know, regulating for density outcomes, putting in place urban limits or significant repurposing of council land. So I think my advice is that recommendation 9.3, it is investigate, but as Michael said, I think there's a provocation there to an extent that yes, we need to address housing, we need to provide additional housing supply, but moving forward, if we actually really want to make realistic gains and targets towards all of our goals, including Goal 4, then we're going to need to seriously rethink the way in which the city is developing and evolving. So it's not an explicit commitment to develop reserves. However, it's a signal that these types of conversations, urban limits, regulating for intensity, or using public land in different ways, will be things that need to be tabled and considered. So it's a to think about rather than this will be happening.
Councillor Johnson, did you have any other questions?
No, I'll just leave it there for now. I'll
Thank you.
save it for comment.
Councillor Harpiter. Okay. Councillor Naylor.
Thank you. My questions relate to minor dwellings, and I'm looking on page 81. I'm just wondering, with minor dwellings not requiring a resource consent, how does council know exactly how many are being built?
So they still require a building consent. So minor dwelling would typically, what it does by its nature, include kitchens and bathrooms, and so they get flagged through the building consent process, which is how we collect that data.
Okay, so in the minor dwellings definition, I think it was, might have been page 87, it talked about them being under 80 square metres. Is there a minimum, or is it just about whether it's got a bathroom and kitchen in it?
Yeah, the main trigger for a dwelling, for a building to be considered a dwelling under our district plan is whether it has a kitchen. And a lot of sleep outs will have bathrooms, but as soon as you have a kitchen, then it can function as an independent unit. And so, yeah, that's the, I guess, the regulatory threshold.
Okay, thank you.
And sleep outs are uncounted in the dwelling data.
Pardon?
Sleep outs aren't counted as dwellings in the dwellings data.
Okay, yes, sorry, just to follow on from that, how would council have any awareness of, if it doesn't have a kitchen, obviously, how many, well, I suppose they're not called minor dwellings if they're not kitchens, but how many sleep outs or how many other dwellings that don't have a building consent? Do we have any way of knowing how many of those sort of dwellings exist or are being built?
There has been reviews by the planning team from time to time going through the consents, trying to identify sleep outs and other dwellings. And it's monitored by the ratings team because there are rating implications once the dwelling has a kitchen.
So in terms of the, just responding to your question, one of the issues that we've got at the moment is that whereas in the past, landowners, if they were building anything above 10 metres squared, had to get a building consent, a lot of sleep outs will fall between sort of 15, 20 metres squared threshold. And the Building Act changed last year, and so you don't need to get a building consent for anything below 30 metres squared now. It's only if you've got something with plumbing, and that triggers a building consent. So it does make things a little bit difficult for monitoring purposes for sleep outs. And we'll have to be mindful of that when we're doing our monitoring going forward.
So can I just ask one further question? So what category did tiny houses come under in terms of what you're talking about?
If they are connected to plumbing, then they'd be required to have a building consent. It is a bit of a murky space, to be honest. I don't think there's any sort of hard and fast rules around how those are regulated at the moment. Some people argue that they're vehicles, some people argue that they're dwellings, but the approach that we tend to take is that if they are connected up to council services, then they're required to pay a service connection, development contributions. They're treated as a minor dwelling. They should be back from the boundary to meet district plan requirements, and then they'll get picked up through that process.
Thank you.
Councillor Beattie.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just one question left. On page 40 of the statistics, you've got 72 one-bedroom dwellings in 2020. Does that include Papio Place and Soho?
Yes.
So really, there's only been, when you take that, there's pretty much no minimal one bedrooms then have been built privately.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Hancock.
Thanks, Madam Chair. I've got sort of three areas of focus, I guess. The first one really is just a little bit of, I'm just seeking a little bit of reassurance around the 685 families that are on the social housing register, 85% of which require one or two bedroom homes. Can you just tell us or reassure me that those people don't actually appear on registers, perhaps in neighbouring territorial authorities? Do we have some comfort around that?
We assume Kaingaroa only has them in one place, but because the data is reported nationally, so they report a national total, and then that is broken down by local authority. But there is some duplication with the council's own waiting list for housing. Some people will be on both waiting lists. So that data is published by each territorial authority, and the sum of that adds up to the total for New Zealand.
Yeah, so I think the short answer is that we don't really have reassurance on that.
Well, I think it appears that a single location is being recorded for each household. So they're recorded as wanting a house in Palmas North, not in Live-In as well.
Okay, thank you. All right, I'll leave that there. The next area there is just in terms of the 1,417 infill housing opportunities across the city. I assume that we identify those through GIS mapping?
Yes, they're identified through GIS, and each individual site was eyeballed. So it was done on a section by section basis based on some particular metrics that align with the district plan. So there was quite a concerted effort to identify those opportunities.
Okay, and just on that, so are there any opportunities to actually incentivise the subdivision or building opportunities on those sections? Do we contact people who actually own those homes? Are we having any contact with developers or anything else like that to try and actually sort of incentivise and actually make that happen?
I think in terms of council's role in that space for incentivising, a lot of it's really around regulation. And so when we did the residential zone review in 2018, that created a lot more opportunities for infill development. So the minimum lot size was reduced from 400 to 350 metres squared. And there was some much more permissive rules around what you could do for development. So I'm not aware of any other, I guess, financial incentives or anything like that that council has sought to enact to try and stimulate that. But I'd probably say that looking at the economic data and the indicators that PETA produces or monitors, the land values are increasing significantly, and that's probably the biggest driver for infill development. It's making it a lot more economically possible for people across the city to do infill subdivision, and the map that I showed you earlier just shows to what extent that's taken place. So it's been a really even spread. I'd probably say that the opportunities are there. It's probably, whether or not the landowners have the capital to make it happen, and then the development sector is very active and engaging with landowners where they think that they can get maybe a couple of sections and do a bit of site agglomeration and then subdivide. There's a lot of that happening. There's a few development companies in Palmas to North who are quite active in that space, but a lot of the mum and dad subdivision that's happening is generally, subdividing off the backyard or the front yard, and that still seems to be the predominant form of infill development that's happening, and it probably will be until someone, takes the opportunity to actually remove the house and try and maximise potential. But that'll be largely driven by economics.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so there's obviously some opportunities there. And just lastly, the housing capacity assessment's got a lot of information there in terms of population growth, short-term supply of land, consenting capacity, building capacity. What I'm really interested in, we've started from a deficit position where we've actually had sort of under-supply situation. So through modelling, do we have any understanding of when we get convergence in terms of that supply and demand? And I'm talking about housing affordability, which is obviously front of mind.
It's actually very difficult to assess because what they call the labour market catchment for the city, where our workforce comes from, is actually much wider than the city boundary. And so we have had a deficit for probably 40 years because some of those local authorities adjacent to us were experiencing population decline until quite recently. So they had a lot of cheap housing available, and that encouraged our workforce out. Now, all of the councils around us are struggling with the same problem of building enough housing. So some of it will depend on how efficient we are in terms of providing new land for housing, as well as allowing that intensification to occur. And the city's had intensification happening actually for about 40, 50 years. A lot of that housing stock, particularly close to the city centre, has been replaced. And so the housing stock actually in the city is much newer than in the surrounding towns and villages.
But with all the data that we've actually got, is it possible perhaps to do some projections around low, medium, high, estimates of date or time where we have that convergence, so we've got some understanding of when we will kind of sort of reach the point where we've actually got need and supply a match? Is it possible?
The additional margin we're required to provide is very similar to the Infometrics high growth projections. I personally believe they got their projections, that they are too low. They really struggled. They had 3 attempts at doing projections for all of the councils in the region. Their initial set of projections had all of the growth occurring in Palmerston North and nothing in Maruatua and Horowhenua. They had another go, and that had most of the growth happening in Maruatua and Horowhenua and very little in Palmerston North. But I think their estimate for total growth for those 3 councils is actually too low. Because they were quite conservative in terms of their growth assumptions around the investment coming. You know, back then we were talking about $3 billion worth of investment. The latest numbers are suggesting $7 billion or more of investment. So the picture is actually changing so quickly. It's actually really difficult to project growth. You know, the biggest investment is going to be Kiwi Rail and the investment it attracts. So that's why we have to keep doing it every 3 years, because the picture just continues to change.
Great, thanks. Thanks, Madam Chair.
Councillor Dingwell.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Michael and Peter, for this report. I've got sort of 3 areas as well that I'm keen to look at, so I think we'll start with the easiest one. On page 67, you were looking at, find it. We were looking at the kinds of measures that you use to sort of monitor basically the innovative and growing city strategy. And I was wondering, is it possible to measure how many houses we have in Palmerston North that are actually vacant? And also what percentage of overall housing is actually social housing as opposed to housing as a whole? Is that a thing that we could look at through this type of assessments?
The census attempts to measure the vacant dwellings, but they've actually had considerable difficulty with that. In 2013, the census identified, I think, close to 1,000 vacant dwellings, and nationally there was concern that that number was wrong, you know, not just for Palmerston North. And so for the 2018 census, I understand Statistics New Zealand was going to work with power companies to find out whether there was still an active power account. Yeah, because a house may be empty for a while, but that's because the resident is working somewhere else in New Zealand, or sometimes even overseas, or away on a long holiday. And so when the census is done, it's actually very difficult to identify whether there is someone who lives there sometimes but isn't there during that census period. And it would be a huge exercise for council to do that regularly across the, I think 29,000 houses in the city.
Okay, so you... Oh, sorry.
And in terms of the other part of your question, so we do have some of that information at hand, and it's largely accounted for by looking at land ownership, and so Housing New Zealand, Kaingwater, etc., and some of the trusts that provide social housing, we can get that from our ratings database, and it indicates how many dwellings there are per site. So we have some of that information available.
Okay, cool. The second one was around sort of the future trends on page 45. I'm just wondering how conservative those numbers there. 3 sort of scenarios that pop into my mind are the blended families where you have parents who split up, and you've got, the kids spend half the time with one parent and then half the time with the other parent. So you still need the big houses on both sides because the kids end up there sort of half the time. And the other scenario was the way that COVID is sort of encouraging some people to work from home now and not having to travel quite a bit. And the other one is I'm seeing a lot with Pacifica families where they're now trying to buy massive houses because they know that there'll be 3 or 4 generations that are going to live there because they're feeling like their kids will never be able to buy a home. So are we looking at all of those kind of scenarios as well? And with all that in mind, how conservative are these numbers?
Projections aren't forecasts because we really don't know what's going to happen over the next 20 years. So they use the past to present a picture of what the future might look like if past trends continue. And, you know, the changes the council's made around even minor dwellings recognise that sort of opportunity for multi-generational families living on a similar site, but it's very difficult to predict.
Okay, so when we're looking at this kind of, I guess, assessment to sort of look at how many houses we might need going forward, we're basing this based on the last sort of past years rather than predicting what might happen in the future. Is that what you're saying?
But looking at demographic trends, so we've got an ageing population, so more likely to be couple-only or single-person households, and a long-term trend in terms of single-person households. You know, people not marrying until much later, staying single, not necessarily wanting to go flatting, and so that single-person household has been increasing, as well as couple-only households, and that's often couples who haven't had children or who have had children but they've left home, and so it's just the couple at home. But even they're hard to assess. You know, some of those older couples still want a big house, so there's enough room for the kids and the grandkids to come and visit. And it's really difficult to link the size of the house to the household.
Yeah, okay, cool. And I guess my last question, I'm still a bit confused about the process with these recommendations around that 9.3, I think it was, around the sports fields.
I'll separate 9.3 out when it comes to voting, and we'll vote on that as a standalone recommendation rather than grouping them.
Excellent, cool, thank you.
There's still a number of questions, so if we can try to keep them as concise as possible, that would be helpful. Councillor McCarlard.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just one question. Thanks, Michael, for the report. Just one question in what was actually mentioned in the report. You mentioned that you were looking at promoting multi-units and multi-unit development and mini dwellings, and also partnering with development community to encourage intensification. Can you please illuminate me probably on how you intend to do this? I know that you've mentioned, you've given a few points on page 88, but are there, do we have other incentives that we can use or put in place to encourage this? Have we looked at other councils and how they do that as well?
One of the main approaches that we take is, in terms of that collaborating with the private sector, is our senior urban designer, Dave Charnley, administers a fund called Delivering Change. It's quite a small fund, but it has been used to kind of leverage some good outcomes. So it's covered off a little bit in this report. What we try to do is provide a little bit of assistance to the private market when they're coming in for applications for things like multi-unit in particular, because there's a lot of design considerations that come with that to try and create livable outcomes. And so we resource architects, urban designers, to work with the applicant to try and arrive at a design that is going to be consentable. And what we're trying to do as part of that process as well is try to maximise yield and try and get some of those good livability outcomes that the district plan's seeking. So that's one way that we try to, I guess, work with the private sector to try and co-create to get good outcomes. It's been relatively successful where it's been used. It's probably fair to say that the Palmas North development community is still in a bit of a development phase in terms of how it responds to some of the urban design changes that we've brought through the district plan. And it's a way that we can assist the development community to, I guess, give effect to the district plan. In terms of enabling more multi-unit development, apartments and things like that, there have been some moves through the last 10 years to enable a lot more of that to happen through the district plan. So when we did Plan Change 1, that was the review of our business zones, we enabled a lot more opportunity for apartments in the CBD. So you can do that now. Hasn't been a huge uptake. It's probably going to be market-led in a lot of cases. I'd probably say as a general statement that the district plan has set up a relatively enabling framework for intensification to be able to happen. A lot more progressive than a lot of other councils. And yeah, ultimately it's going to be up to the market to decide whether they want to deliver it. We'd like to see more of it happening, and we will have to make some changes to the district plan in the future to give effect to the national policy statement. So there's a few changes to overall national direction around intensification, and we will have to respond to that. That'll come through some future work, and we can investigate a whole range of different opportunities to try and encourage and maybe even require intensification in some places. So, for instance, close to CBD or close to some of the local business zones, we could define some areas like we already have with our multi-unit zones, but instead of people being able to do just an infill subdivision perhaps, where they might just carve off the backyard or the front of their section to put one single dwelling, we might look at requiring more intensive development to happen there instead, so that more efficient use of land takes place in those areas. And that is something that some of the Tier 1 councils are required to do under the national policy statement. So we could take a little bit of learning from the likes of Auckland and Wellington and sort of see how they're doing things there as well. But there will be some future work that has to happen in that space, which forms some of the recommendations in this report.
Thank you.
Councillor Butt.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, team, for the report. Probably half of my question has already been answered. Underutilization of sports fields. Do we have a definition of the proper utilization of sports fields? And don't you think if there is any underutilization, it is due to, as described in your report, that most of the sports fields are unavailable in winter due to poor soil conditions. Don't you think this underutilization is due to poor soil conditions?
Yes, I think that's definitely part of the issue. As someone who enjoys sports and has utilised a lot of the sports playgrounds and the like, growing up in Palmas the North, I can attest to the fact that there are many frustrations during winter not being able to play, and a lot of that is due to soil conditions. I think, as I kind of mentioned before, it is a bit of a provocative statement around looking at the potential repurposing of sports playgrounds, perhaps an opportunity to develop those for housing and reinvest them in high quality facilities. It's a piece of work that would have to be undertaken. There would be a lot of feasibility assessments and things like that would have to be undertaken to figure out what's possible, what's necessary, what's the appetite of the community, and it's really a bit of a signal that a future conversation could be had about that.
I'd just make a comment there. The principle would not necessarily be using sports fields for housing and then not providing any other sports fields. The concept that could be looked at from a low carbon future could be, how do we use all of our resources to best work towards all of our goals? So we have sports fields in central locations close to amenities, facilities and places of work, but people are driving to the edge of town to live. You know, one scenario that's explored through the future development strategy could be, and it's not a firm recommendation, could be to repurpose land for housing in more sustainable locations than greenfield areas, and then relocate sports fields or develop new sports fields in other locations. So it's not an anti-sport thing, and it's not an anti-sports fields thing, and it's not an anti-playgrounds thing. The suggestion that is explored is, how do we work towards a future for the city that achieves all of our goals and delivers housing, but puts houses in the most sustainable location?
Thank you.
Councillor Bowen.
Thank you. I will speak through my chattering teeth on this side of the room. It's a question about the, quite high level, about the interplay of national policy statements. So this piece of work is driven by the NPS on urban development. In the report you reference the coming NPS on highly productive land. So what impact is that NPS likely to have on this kind of work driven by the NPS on urban development?
There's a draft that's been out for about 18 months on the highly productive land, and I guess it's fair to say that a priority hasn't necessarily been set by government, so it's probably provided a bit more uncertainty than certainty around what stacks up and what's more important than the other. The one clear message that we've got in the MPS for urban development is that council's required to provide opportunities for housing, and that if the market demand is for housing, then the council is required to provide for that. So there is, I guess, an insinuation that housing is the priority at the moment, but I think we'll have to wait to see what comes out with the highly productive land MPS when it lands, and I guess how those priorities are juggled at a national direction level. I think I'd probably just note that the one plan from the regional council does place requirements on council already to think about high-class soils, and the one plan was probably a bit more advanced than a lot of other regional councils across the country in terms of wanting to protect that resource. So unlike a lot of other councils that are sort of grappling with this housing issue and trying to balance up competing interests, we already have some pretty strong direction from Horizons in terms of what those expectations are, so we have to take that into account with our planning already.
Okay, thank you. And my second area of interest was around the commentary on urban design, which you cover on your page 64, and then it feeds into recommendation 9.5. So it seems to be the direction we're taking in this report is say, yeah, we've said what we require for urban design and developers just need to get a bit better at it. Is that the extent of the conversation? Is there some work to work with developers as to what would make this easier for them?
Yes, absolutely. So there's developer forums that we have where we sort of talk through some of these issues. We do have that Delivery and Change Fund, which we are trying to leverage some, I guess, educational outcomes as well as good development outcomes. And if I'm going to be blunt, I think it's been a bit of a journey for council and the development sector in Palmas North to kind of come along together. There has been a step change in terms of introducing urban design criteria into our district plan, but looking at some of the past outcomes that we've seen in the city, they've been necessary. And so there will, you know, we're still in the early stages of implementing an urban design focused district planning response, and I think there'll be a bit of a timing issue, but we are looking to educate. We've had developer forums, we've had design forums, we've brought in experts from outside of the city to try and facilitate understanding around how to work in that space. And I'd say we've got a relatively good working relationship with the developers in town. It's just a bit of a sticking point with the district plan at the moment, and with this MPS as well, like I mentioned before, we are going to have to make some future changes to the district plan to make development a little bit more enabling.
Right.
And as part of that, we'll think about how we could improve the district plan and try and make the outcomes a little bit clearer. So in this report, I've flagged that there could be an argument that there's some ambiguity around how you balance the different competing interests around amenity, different design criteria outcomes, and we could take a more directive approach. The second generation plan, really, the philosophy of it changed quite significantly from the old district plan. We took a lot more of an enabling approach by opening up the door for more restricted discretionary activities, but I think the feedback we've received from the community is that they don't necessarily want to engage in an ambiguous space. They're happy to have a bit more rope to be able to look at different options, but perhaps providing a bit more of a conservative development envelope may be a better approach, and we just regulate it through that way with a bit more sort of directive outcomes that we're looking. So there's a whole lot of technical planning requirements that we'll look at around how we can make that pathway a little bit easier, but in the meantime I think it would be helpful if I guess there was more design support that was accompanying some of these more intensive development outcomes. We probably haven't seen the level of design expertise involved in consenting that we would have expected based on what the district plan is requiring. And it's very common in all the metros in the country, and some of the larger regional cities as well. So what we're doing isn't unusual.
Okay, thank you, Michael. Madam Chair.
Councillor Johnson.
It's a question for you, Madam Chair. So you indicated that you would take 9.3 separately.
Yes.
But 9.3 has really got two parts to it, one of which I'm happy with and one of which I'm not. So would you consider an amendment on 9.3, or would you consider splitting it into the two parts? Because undertake council-owned housing development, I'm perfectly happy with. What I'm not happy with is investigate opportunities to repurpose reserves for housing.
So what we're going to do is, once we've finished questions, we're going to adjourn for morning tea, and we will consider how we can separate out that and tidy up some of these, because there's going to be more than 3 recommendations now with dividing some of them up. So we can consider that in the break.
I was just going to make a comment on 9.3, because recognising that there was 2 parts and sort of preempting that, I guess that one of the things I would say with that first part of 9.3, that is, it's effectively covered in other parts of council strategies and plans. So, I mean, I think, for instance, if you voted against 9.3 and it passed or failed, the first component of section 9.3 is really covered in other strategies and plans. It's probably that second component which is more controversial.
Well,
so
yes,
I'm just going to leave that there. Are there any other questions for officers on the report?
Sorry, Madam Chair, am I able to respond to the officer?
No, not at the moment. Are there any other questions on the report? Great. So we are going to close questions. We're going to adjourn for morning tea, and we will be back in here at 11:05. Thanks, everybody. We will resume. So we've got several recommendations in front of us now, which are mostly based on the original officer recommendations. Recommendation 1 hasn't changed from what's in the order papers. Recommendation 2 has separated out, instead of it being 9.1 to 9.6, we've removed 9.3, and then we've specified that 9.6 be referred to the rates review for consideration. So that's the changes there. What we're suggesting, it'll come up in a moment, is that 9.3 be amended to read as the final paragraph under 9.3. And so instead of undertake council-owned housing developments and investigate opportunities to repurpose reserves for housing, it will now say investigations should also be undertaken to determine whether underutilised reserves, including sports fields, can be partially or fully repurposed for housing. So that is the sentence that's taken directly from the report and separates that out from the other recommendations and leaves you to vote on that how you will. The 4th recommendation is as per the order papers. So I'll move all 4 of those, but we will vote on them one by one. Seconded by Councillor Hancock. We might, in the interest of trying to keep this tidy, we might look at the first resolution. So this is that the report be received, and what I'll do is I'll just open for comment on recommendation 1 to begin with. Councillor Barrett, you're commenting on recommendation 1? Just 1, that we receive the report. Yes. Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think this is actually a very useful set of reports we've actually got. Both the assessments and the indicators are quite information-rich, but really get to those underlying issues and opportunities. So I think first up, we're actually just really seeing the value of having NPS-mandated reporting in terms of really supporting our long-term thinking and planning. So it's really good to see those reports through, and would acknowledge the work that Tara and others have done on those. Overall, I think this assessment gives us a fair warning that if we don't start thinking about doing some things differently, that we will begin to lose the advantages that we currently enjoy as a compact city. And I think that's a fair warning, and one that we need to hear. Unfortunately, the assessment report also talks about some solutions, some of which are a bit more contentious perhaps than others. But I think it's a really nice balance in the report of giving us both some of the challenges and some of the range of solutions. And I think the prize is big enough in terms of maintaining the advantages of a compact city form that we do look at the range of conversations we might need to have with the community. So just wanted to acknowledge the work that's gone into the report and look forward to the specific decisions on the recommendations. Certainly welcome the officer comments accompanying the report around really, yes, it's a housing capacity assessment report, but it's about functional communities and how we actually have a functional and sustainable community in the future. So that's my overall comment. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anyone else wishing to comment? Councillor Beattie.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I too would like to acknowledge the work that's done on this report. It's really good, and it's good to see that the city's got a really good balance, and going forward, we are lucky as a city that we have got places where we can rezone and have additional sections. I'm really pleased around the promotion of the minor dwellings. That's been something that I've been pushing for a long time, although I'm a bit disappointed in the uptake, especially when you see that there's not much in the uptake of them. But I think that we can start doing promotions, and I think once that people with land, especially just homeowners with that small piece of land at the back. I think once they realise what they can do with it, also with the government changes, with the interest for building new, and ANZ last week coming out with the lowest interest rates for building new, there could be advantages for the city. One of the main things I'm really concerned about, though, is the one-bedroom and two-bedroom homes and the lack of social housing in the city. When you see that register of 685, and in the last year, Kaingora has only been able to have 12 additional social housing homes, even though they have funded council Papiai housing, and there's been the Soho development. In the next 3 years, we have only got 300 additional houses in Palmerston. That's only 100 each year. How are we going to reduce that 685? And, you know, that means there's still going to be kids in motels, and these are the critical people that are not getting housed. And through this report, and with the lack of one bedrooms, I'm just can't see how that 685 in 3 years is going to come down to a manageable level. And I'm just really worried that within 3 years we are not going to be getting out of these motel situations. But I'll leave it at that. Yes, I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Councillor Naylor.
Yeah, thank you. I also think it's a very good plan, and I'm really pleased with the recommendations that are contained within it, in particular the emphasis on promoting intensification and the recommendations to do that additional social media and leaflets and things around the minor dwellings. I think now more than ever before, with land prices the way they are going and are going up very quickly, I think the answer to many of our housing issues will be within the further developing that infill and actually making people aware of their opportunities. And I think looking at the small uptake of those opportunities in the last year probably highlights that people generally aren't aware of the opportunities that do exist. And I think Councillor Beatty's mentioned similar things, but you know, it's not just for the developers, it's for your average landowner that has a large backyard or a large front yard that they can actually utilise. That's a very cost-effective way of improving our housing. So yeah, really happy to support all of the recommendations in this report.
Councillor Finlay.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll support all the recommendations, but I'm just looking at the what we're voting for, and with all the subdivisions we're having now, we're losing the quarter-acre section, you know, which is our past. You know, our children would play in the backyard, would have a garden, kids would dig holes, they'd climb trees, all in the backyard. This is a thing of rapidly becoming a thing of the past, where we don't have backyards anymore. My daughter's just bought a subdivided house, which was once a quarter-acre section, but when she has children, they're going to have a piece of land that wide to play on. And to me, it's sad to see it go. I understand why we have to subdivide to put more houses up, but the children, the next generation, are going to suffer for it, and it's a sad thing to see come happen. Just wanted to say that.
Councillor Dennison.
Thank you, Madam Chair. General comments. Identifying the need, which is fairly pressing. Alongside that, though, is the need for the consenting staff internally here to process the applications for the output. And already our consenting team is under the pump. And so what this highlights to me is that we need to get serious around how we get through the applications for new house builds and all the other resource that's needed, which is like the build teams and everything else. So a lot of those industries are at their maximum output, and so it puts on the pipeline for the apprenticeship schemes here locally to be promoted, and yeah, the consenting teams. And what's a challenge, I guess, is when Kairanga Ora set up their own housing consenting unit, we're stretching the staff between the two and putting pressure. And what that has done is done nothing for the individuals that wanted to put in submissions for subdivisions and building consents, because our team's been diluted, and yet the increased demand keeps going up. And so, again, that's putting real value on those ones with that experience and skill in that sector. And I think we should be really pushing in to do what we can to attract and retain and be market leading, I guess, to make sure that we've got the team, so we're not hindering our growth that we're expecting and want for our thriving city. So I'm just underpinning that. And of course, all the land use and exploring, investigating other options for rezoning and even reserves. I guess we've got to be open-minded to that approach, is what I'd say, when the need is so pressing. And so, thank you, Chair.
No other comments on recommendation 1? Great, I'll invite you to vote. That has carried 100%. So moving on to recommendation 2, and I will open up for any comment on this one. Councillor Johnson.
So I just want to comment on some of the recommendations that we're voting for in this particular recommendation, because I generally am supportive of them, and in particular, the option for more intensification, because I do think that having the minimum lot size as 500 square metres in Ashurst and 350 square metres everywhere else is a restriction on infill. And infill is a useful means for us to increase the housing stock without sprawling further and further out from the city. So I'm very supportive of that option. And I'm also supportive of anything that we can do to reduce incentives for land banking. And I understand why we're referring 9.6 to the rates review, but I would say that if giving people a discount on their undeveloped land is leading to them not wanting to develop it, then that is a perverse outcome, and one that we certainly need to be considering changing when the opportunity arrives. In terms of promoting the minor dwellings, I was interested to hear that somebody has sort of been around and eyeballed every opportunity for a minor dwelling in the city. Could we not actually notify those people that they've got the option of putting a minor dwelling on their property? Because most of them will probably not be aware. And so we clearly have all of the addresses and we know where they are. It would seem to me to be a very small thing to do to actually notify those people and perhaps refer them to the document that's been produced on the website about the ability to put a minor dwelling on your property. And although this isn't mentioned in the 9.2 recommendation, one of the disincentives, which is mentioned in the report for minor dwellings, is that putting another dwelling on your property results in a doubling of your rates, pretty much. And therefore, when we're doing the rates review, we need to also have a look at what our rating policies are doing at the moment to disincentivise people from putting minor dwellings on their properties. So supportive of us promoting them, but I think there's possibly more we can be doing, and we do need to be looking at the rate setting on those. In terms of rezoning, I mean, we heard, about the very large areas of greenfield that are being looked at for rezoning, and that is certainly going to give us a range of section sizes. I'm a bit cautious, though, about the compulsion for multi-unit zones in particular areas. I mean, that might work close into the CBD, but I'm not sure that that's going to be very palatable to developers out in a greenfield site. So all in all, I think an interesting and useful set of recommendations. most of which I think are quite useful. Thank you.
Councillor Bowen.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yep, happy to support this particular recommendation in front of us, and the general thrust of this report, I think, provides a really useful suite of recommendations here, levers for council to use to go forward in addressing the housing capacity issues of the city. There's no question it's a complex area. It's complex in terms of the legislative frameworks, the NPS for urban development, balancing that with highly productive land that's going to come ahead. It's a complex area. There is no silver bullet. If there was, we wouldn't be in this situation. So we do have to take a look across the options that are available to council, and I very much see this as a suite of things that we can be doing. And they're interconnected. An impact in one area may well have an impact in another that will then need to be addressed. So I'm glad to see that this is going to become a 3-yearly report that we'll see coming through. And particularly following the comment, very good comment from Councillor Johnson there about the rates review and how this is important in looking at the impact of pulling some of these levers. That might actually be our better way of getting runs on the board than just the policy work itself. But also recognising that it sits within complicated language that our community doesn't really understand. And we heard that even in the chamber this morning. The officers talk about minor dwellings, and we're saying, well, is that a tiny house? Is that a sleep out? What is it that you're talking about? The community don't know what we mean, and we need to get better at speaking their language so that they know what the options are in front of them. So I'm very happy to support this recommendation.
Councillor Dingwall.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I am happy to support these recommendations here in front of us today. I'm particularly pleased to see 9.4 around developing partnerships, because I feel like that's one of the things that we haven't quite been able to achieve as much as we could have so far. I know that there's, lots of people often talk about supply and demand, that is the reason for our housing crisis, but actually being able to do more than just leaving it to the market is a brilliant idea, because we know that the market is basically why we're in this situation in the first place. So I'm quite keen to further develop partnerships with iwi and social housing providers to take some of that pressure off and to do something about the 600 people on our waiting list who urgently need housing, but also to do it in a way where, if possible, some of that land is retained in this kind of ownership, in council ownership or in social housing providers, rather than just saying, free up more land and selling it all off. So I'm really pleased to see this part as well as the rest of these recommendations. So yeah, happy to support this one.
Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a couple comments here around the specific recommendations. Certainly supportive of seeing 9.6 going to, I think, a more relevant forum for it. But really wanted to just comment on the inherent tension, I think, between some of these, especially 9.1 and 9.5. So, just in the rezoning sort of that's signaled in here, we're looking at about 400 hectares of basically sprawl still happening. That's 4 square kilometers. That's quite a lot of currently productive or rural residential land getting gobbled up into urban form. And not only does that make quite a permanent land use change to those rezoned areas, it also ultimately affects the economics around intensification. And one of the big drivers around intensification is the economic side of that equation. And so, I do have concerns when I see the targets sitting in the medium and long term showing infill, including intensive housing, making less of a proportional contribution. Acknowledge that that's sort of a dilution effect as we rezone these big areas of land. But I remain concerned about the balance of what we're actually able to achieve when we're moving quite aggressively in terms of rezoning. These are some of the biggest rezonings that will be happening in a generation in this city, vis-a-vis the intensification and actually realizing the benefits of city center living, of a more compact urban form, et cetera. So look, a really helpful report again, and a good set of recommendations that I'm prepared certainly to support. But there is still much tension within these yet to be resolved.
Councillor Harper.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Support these recommendations, particularly interested in 9.6. I think the discussion that will be had with developers about 9.6 will be really interesting, but I think the discussion needs to be had. I think teasing that out and the way in which that discussion will be had with the officers and the developers will be an interesting discussion. I'd love to be the fly on the wall in that discussion, but I think it'll be a good one to be had, good one to go forward with that. It's timely, and I think going forward, it'll be good to see some of the release of that land, and this will be a good incentive to see that release of that land. But thank you.
Thank you. With no more comments on recommendation 2, I'll invite you to vote. That has carried 100%. Moving on to recommendation 3, I'll open up for comments on this one. Councillor Bowen.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm speaking in support of this recommendation that is for investigations to be undertaken. And I just wanted to explain why, because my position has changed slightly on this from early discussions as part of our LTP. I get that this is a sensitive subject and we don't want to be going out saying we're selling off sports fields. That's not why I'm supporting this. But I am influenced by the submissions that came through our LTP, and particularly looking for a change in the way that we do sports, seeing that there's requests from our community to invest in more artificial turf, to invest in more covered facilities, and recognising that our sports field and reserves were fit for purpose when they went in those places and might not meet community needs now and into the future. And so I think it's appropriate that in light of the housing crisis we find ourselves in, that we investigate, and only that, no commitment to do anything, but investigate to determine whether there is underutilisation or there could be better utilisation in different locations, and that land might then be suitable to be repurposed for housing. I get that that's controversial, but this is a step towards investigating, which, as I said in my earlier comments, I feel sits appropriately in a suite of options to deal with our housing capacity issues. So I'll be supporting this recommendation. Thank you.
Councillor Johnson.
Well, I won't be supporting this recommendation, and I would just like to remind councillors of a public consultation that was undertaken in 2013, where people from, I believe it was the property team, were sent to go and look at underutilised pieces of reserve around the city, and a proposal was put out for those pieces of land to be sold for housing development. And there were hundreds and hundreds of submissions, and it took days for council to hear them all. And I was one of those submitters, and it was partly that issue that encouraged me to stand for council. So there's absolutely no way at this point I'm going to support a selling off reserves and or sports fields for housing. Yes, there's a housing crisis, but we've seen from this report that we've got the potential for thousands and thousands of sections to be developed. We're not at a stage yet where we need to trade in the sports fields and reserves around the city for housing. And I would just remind you that having green space is part of a community amenity. Not everybody has got a car and transport to go out to, the beach or some other reserve outside the city. Some people rely on their local reserve, their local sports field for green space for recreation. And I just can't see that removing those is something that we should be doing. And I also don't think it's something that the community would support. Yes, we did have a submission, a rather extreme one, that we should consider selling off parks and reserves for housing. But frankly, I don't think that represents the majority view. So I really urge you to be cautious. It might only be an investigation now, but we're setting a direction. And the next thing you know, there'll be a paper coming to council suggesting another set of reserves for sale, and then we'll need to be consulting on that. And it just causes angst and anxiety in the community. We heard this morning from people from Cloverley about how anxious they are about housing being built to take out their view of green fields and the countryside. And every community in the city will be coming in complaining if we're talking about selling the reserve that's outside their house. So really, councillors, please think carefully about what you're voting for here. Anything can be justified if you say that there's a crisis, but we've got a whole raft of other recommendations here of actions that we're going to be doing to make sure that we can provide for sufficient housing in the city. And I don't think we're at the point where we need to be thinking about selling off sports fields.
Councillor Dennison.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think Councillor Johnson's raised some very good concerns because 2013 did raise the heckles of the wider community, and that was a suite of recommendations of reviewing all sorts of parcels of land that in many cases we didn't even know we had. They were so small and residential developments. But this is a little bit different in my mind. I see this as just investigating. We know that there's another whole subset of process below any identified piece of land to rezone it from reserve into urban development residential. And examples that are noted in the report have actually been received quite well as proposals around Huia Street and Summerhays. I know they were retired old bowling facilities. However, they're in well-located places where urban development lends itself quite well. And so therefore, the bit I particularly like around this is could be partially. Doesn't mean that we're going to necessarily investigate using the whole reserve. It could be just identified maybe half here or a portion of something that's in a good location that's going to fulfil the needs if the use hasn't been fulfilled through recreation and sport. So I'm open-minded. I know that there's robust processes behind this, and so therefore I'm going to support the recommendation on that basis. Thank you.
Councillor Harper.
Thanks, Madam Chair. I won't be supporting this. I think Councillor Johnson did raise some good points. I think our community gets tired of us going out with these proposals. They get tired of us putting these things up for consultation, and they get just absolutely fed up with this nonsense sometimes that we go out with this consultation and they just get angry. And I get angry with us going out with it as well. So I think we've got a goal there, which is activation, and we are trying to activate our community through Sport Manawatu. And I don't want to see us go out there and take away some sports fields, take away some reserves to build houses because we see a need for that. We've still got things like our the Roxburgh Crescent, we've still got the depot, which we're looking to investigate to go and build houses on. Let's go and look at those areas that we're still wanting to investigate to go and do, rather than try and take away amenities that we've got in our community that are treasured by our community. I don't want to take away our treasures. Let's look at the opportunities that we've got in front of us and not take away things that are treasures in our community already. Thank you.
Councillor Dingwall.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I will not be supporting this. I'm a massive fan of getting more housing in Palmerston North, but there are ways to do it that don't require taking away reserves and sport fields. And I know that this is just at the investigations phase, but I agree with the comments from Councillor Johnson and Councillor Harper, where the community is sick and tired of hearing us talk about potentially getting rid of more reserves. Once they're gone, they are gone. It's very hard to take a whole development off a reserve and bring it back to its natural state again. So I think You know, even with the issue, the Huia Street and Summerhays, we haven't actually made a decision on those yet. You know, that we are still consulting on some of those and trying to work out where to from here. So I think it's, so I will not be supporting this because I think we need to actually start showing the community that we do care about the reserves and sports fields that we've already got, and that we're not just blanket trying to sell things off for housing. We heard all of those comments through the Keisha Birch discussion as well. That wasn't even part of the discussion of Keisha Birch, but that's what the community was feeling. So I think the less we do that, the better.
Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I certainly do hear and acknowledge the concerns that councillors have raised about, you know, perhaps quite an extreme implementation of this. But, you know, I just reflect that really, in fact, Huia Street and Summerhays are two examples that are in train that actually fit well within the bound of this recommendation. And given that the strength of the recommendation is around investigations, and given around that, you know, Summerhays is well in train, and we were actually quite supportive of that, I think it would actually be more consistent with our current activities to support this. And I think in terms of, you know, the longer and medium term, I just don't see any real reason to totally rule out a specific class of options, because there may be, again, specific cases where this is actually quite a justified thing in our future. And I don't think any of us around the table would be contemplating the more extreme versions of some of what's been suggested in terms of wide spread sale and sell-off. So quite comfortable actually how it sits as investigations, and noting that we're currently actually doing some of this activity.
Councillor Hancock.
Thanks, Madam Chair. I'm actually going to support this, and the reason for that is simply this, is that we've actually had a housing capacity assessment completed, and the bottom line is that really all cards need to be on the table, and we need to be considering absolutely all options in terms of housing needs going forward and community good. So we've got to take a holistic view, approach to all of our land holdings, and there are safeguards here. We're not going to sell off the family jewels. This is really just a consideration in terms of these being in play, I guess, in terms of being considered, and there are proper consultation processes that would follow, so I'm going to support it. Thank you.
Councillor McCarlett.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just wanted to also acknowledge some of the concerns that have been raised by some of my fellow councillors, but I'll be actually voting in favour of this, actually, because I think it's important for us that we actually conduct an investigation to see what land that are currently being underutilized in our city, and see whether there's potential to actually do partial to fully partially repurpose some of those underutilized land for housing, or fully repurpose them for housing. We do have a housing crisis, and at the moment house prices are going up, and I understand that a lot of land, as the report has suggested, being rezoned, and we're actually considering more land for development. But this is simply an investigation, which will actually give us an opportunity to which will actually provide us with information, well-informed, information that will actually inform our decision going forward. This is not a vote on whether to repurpose it, but it's a consideration that's being actually advanced to investigate whether whether underutilized land could be partially or fully repurposed. So I'll be supporting this recommendation on those bases. Thank you.
Councillor Beattie.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm happy to support the recommendations, most of what's already been said, but it's scaremongering to say that we're selling off reserves and parks. We are not doing that today, and nor will we be doing that in the future. I mean, we know from our past experience in 2013 that all these things go out to public consultation. If we decide, and as Councillor Barrett said, look how long it has taken us to do Summer Hayes and Hughes Street, and we haven't even made a decision yet. That has not been ticked off. So all those sports fields and reserves are in safe hands, but we just want to have a look in case there might be one or two of them out there that might have an opportunity. So I'm comfortable to go forward. And just another point too, the government has given direction for councils to actually have a look at all their land for capacity for housing. So that is something that's already, it needs to be an exercise that we do, even if it's just to stamp the government direction.
Just a brief comment from me. I'm also going to support the recommendations in front of us. I agree with Councillor Johnson that this is setting a direction, but possibly for a different reason, because I think that for us to be open-minded around investigating our options, it sends a clear message that actually we are keeping an open mind. Councillor Hancock outlined that actually all our cards need to be on the table at this stage. That doesn't mean that the cards are going to be dealt, but that means that everything is on the table. And I think that in terms of the principles of good decision making, we do need to be open-minded. This doesn't set any direction around ownership, sales, those sorts of things. This sets a direction of investigation, which is purely giving staff an indication that actually we are open-minded, we're happy for those to be looked into, and as it's already been reiterated, particularly by Councillor Beattie, this isn't saying we are selling anything. So I am open-minded, I am happy for things to be considered. That doesn't mean that I would support anything around repurposing or selling or anything like that, but it means that at this stage I'm happy for investigations to be undertaken and keep an open mind. Councillor Finlay.
Just listening to Councillor Johnston, it made my memory go back. And just a warning to councillors, really. If you want to upset our community and you want to see submissions piling into this council building and tying us up for time, try and sell green space. I can think of the railway land. That took us months. I can think of a little bit of land in Hokowhitu at the end of Waterloo Street. We tried to sell that. Someone played cricket in there once. We had submissions in there for 2 days and we backed off it. We had every person in Waterloo Crescent come down to us and banging the tables because they don't want their green space sold. We talk about sports fields. Well, sports fields are sports fields on Saturday, but during the week people take walks in there and they fly kites in there and they do amazing other things. They're not just sports fields, they're green space. Try and sell them. And I'll tell you, you're making a rod for your own back. I will not support this because in long term, I know the next group of councillors that are going to be here are going to suffer for this decision. I'm suggesting you vote against it, believe me.
Right, thank you. Is there anyone who hasn't spoken that wishes to make a comment? Great, I'll invite you to vote.
Excuse me, Madam Chair.
That's carried 9 in favour, 7 against.
I'm just wondering if you could clarify the status of the other part of that recommendation in the report. I haven't got it.
This was an alternative. I did not move the officer's recommendation. I moved an alternative recommendation.
So the first half of 9.3, are we going to endorse that in any way, or do we just assume that goes ahead?
It's already a direction of council. It was just a part of it.
Point of order, Madam Chair. Billy Meehan's name's up on there as voting minutes.
Yes, he's on Teams. He's been on participating in the meeting the whole time.
Hello, Billy.
You might have noticed the voting record's been for the majority of the meeting, at 16 voting. He's online.
Okay.
Right, we've got one more recommendation as a part of this item. So recommendation 4 has already been moved and seconded, and I'll open up if there's any comment on this recommendation. With no one in the queue to comment, I'll invite you to vote. That has carried 100%, 16 in favour. Moving on to our final item, the committee work schedule, page 121. Just invite the Chief Planning Officer to make any comments.
No comments in terms of the work schedule. I can say that I'm seeking an update on the Huia Street Reserve process. So there was due to be a public notice go out shortly about the pending changes to the legislation. So I'll get an update on that, and we can provide that by email or via the Chief Executive's update. So.
Thank you. Are there any questions on the work schedule? Great. I will move that the committee resolve that the Planning and Strategy Committee receive its work schedule dated June 2021, seconded by Councillor Hancock. Is there any comment? Great, I'll invite you to vote. And that has carried 100%. That concludes our business today. Nō reira, na mihi nui kia koutou, ina mana, ina reo, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa.
Councillors, we'll have some lunch, and then we're back in here for those at for the Rangatane meeting at 1 p.m. Thank you. And there is a councillors only after that. And a workshop. It's a busy afternoon. You don't